Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Andrew Holt. I'm the publisher at City and State. I'd like to welcome everybody to what is our first partnership with AARP, Boomtown NYC, and you'll hear about why that name is what it is. I'm gonna get this moving because we're a little bit behind schedule. So I'm gonna introduce the AARP State Director, Beth Finkel, and then we're gonna move to the Comptroller and then into the panel. So if we can have a round of applause for Beth.
Well, good morning, everyone. So I'm Beth Finkel, as he just said, and I'm State Director for New York for AARP. And I just want to thank Tom and the whole City and State team for partnering with us today. And I especially want to thank the New York City Comptroller, Scott Stringer, for coming and helping us with the keynote. And today we're going to be taking an in-depth look at New York City's looming boomer flight problem. Why are so many planning to leave? What it means to the economy, and what can we do about it? Sorry, can you hear better now? Okay. So AARP's got 2.6 million members across New York State, with over 750,000 of them right here in New York City. And they are an uber voting group, with over 500,000 of our members telling us that they had planned to vote in the last mayoral election. This is literally the most powerful voting group in the city, and it's the group that was responsible for electing Bill de Blasio mayor. And why do I say that, right? 75% of baby boomers who voted for Mayor de Blasio, and that accounted for roughly 35% of all of the ballots that were cast. That's a lot. And now they say they're planning to leave. So this is an issue that warrants immediate attention. Hopefully before the next election. There are roughly 1.5 million baby boomers in New York City, not only representing a huge economic impact while they're still in the workforce, but a massive one when they retire as well, to the tune of, are you ready, over $100 billion annually. Yep. And more than half of that, roughly $53 billion of it, could end up in another city or in another state. According to a survey that we just did, 53% of boomers say they plan to leave the city in their retirement. 53%. That's pretty scary. But here's the scarier one. When we look at those boomers who say that they are confident that they'll be able to retire, so these are the ones who are, more comfortable, obviously, more discretionary income, more shopping in the grocery stores, department stores, etc. The boomer flight problem grows even more. Of those who say that they are able to retire, 64% of them say they think they're going to have to leave the city and retire elsewhere. Again, taking their retirement dollars with them. That's their pensions, that's their Social Security. So these are the folks who support economic stimulus in their communities, right? And then they leave. And by the way, they pay their taxes, right? Because this is, solidly the middle class. They're not sending their money offshore anywhere. They're paying their taxes and staying here. And also, they are the human capital that makes the city run. Because when you look at community organizations, who's there volunteering day in, day out, it's older New Yorkers. And so that's an incredible resource that we can't afford to lose. So the $1 million question, or the $1 billion question, is why? From what we asked them, there's a multitude of issues, and probably you all in this audience can name them all yourself. But mostly it's just paying for the basics that has them worried the most. New Yorkers of all age groups, but mostly boomers and 50 plus, are having a very hard time worrying about housing costs and worrying about putting a roof over their heads and keeping it there, especially once they leave the workforce, because then ultimately, how do they keep up with inflation, right? Because their discretionary income diminishes. So they're increasingly also concerned about sky-high utility rates. New York is now paying the highest rates in the continental United States for utilities. And Con Ed customers pay twice the national average for their electricity, 117% higher rates than than are paid by the rest of the country. That's really astounding. So while the vast majority of the 62 a vast majority, 62% of them say that they feel the city's economy is in a downward trend and that it's in rough shape. 35% of them also say that within their own families, things are worse now than they were 4 years ago. So it's clear that this group is worrying about all things about aging in place, livability, and you're going to hear a little bit more about that from our expert on the research that was just done. And we hear this all the time in the news. They're worried about the traffic lights. They're worried about getting across the street. And they're worrying about cars not yielding to pedestrians. We hear this more and more, that feeling of that looming. The cars are coming into that crosswalk, and they're just continuing to come. They don't do a sharp stop, and it's scary for everyone, not just for older people. So Boomer Flight from New York City is really about boomer plight. Most of the boomers who plan to leave are in the middle class. And when the middle leaves, the other social classes become even more polarized. And no New Yorkers who love the city ever want to see that happen. So these are the core issues we're here to talk about today. They are the issues that New York City must address. New York must be a better place to work, live, and age. And you know what? 2 out of 3 is not acceptable. So today, we want to make it happen. And AARP is really looking forward to working with our city lawmakers to do that. And I'm hoping that next year we'll be convened again and we'll be in a whole different place. And we'll already be seeing a difference in the policies that are affecting 50 plus to ensure that they're going to be able to age in place. So I want to hand the baton over to our New York City Controller, Scott Stringer, who it's really my pleasure to introduce, and I like to kid him about this, but to me, he is the face of the new baby boomer, newly minted 50-year-old. You know, the last 50-year-old turns, the last baby boomer turns 50 in December of this year. So that again tells you about the demographic trend that's about to hit, that aging tsunami that we're all talking about. But he is also the father of 2 small children. So I think it also tells you about how times are changing, how the needs of the 50 plus are changing, and how looking forward to retiring and saving enough for retirement and being able to live out your years in New York is such an important piece of the work that we do. And we couldn't have a better advocate to do that than the city controller. So thank you.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. I think I want to first start out by thanking Tom Allen and Andrew Holt, whose dad I've known for a very long time as the publisher of City and State, and of course to Beth Finkel, who really laid out a very important agenda. So I'm very glad to be here. And, you know, when I turned 50 a couple of years ago, you know, I was okay with it. I really was. No, I was. You know, people freak out about it, right? I got it. I was fine. And, you know, a couple of weeks go by and I'm still 50 and it's okay. And then I open up my mailbox and I get that AARP card in the mail. And I lost it. I said, it has arrived. They said this day would come. So I immediately got married. Now I have a 2.5-year-old and a 1-year-old. So I want to let all of you know, I have the energy to do this job, okay? So, you know, where I live in my neighborhood, they don't call me controller, they call me AARP daddy, okay? And I have to, that's right. And I really actually do respect the 50 plus who are running around with baby carriages and kids. It's really I think it's a great moment in your life, and I'm certainly very happy about it. And I am a proud member of the baby boom generation, and the discussion you have here today is striking a personal chord for me, as I'm sure with some of you. In May 1951, Sylvia Porter, who's a columnist for the New York Post, first used the term boom to describe the amazing growth of young families in post-war America. She called the 3.5 million babies born in 1950 the biggest, boomiest boom ever known in history. And you know, she was right. When it ended in 1964, 76 million Americans had been born. It was a generation that would transform American life and has had a huge impact here in New York City. In the last 30 years, our city has seen an incredible economic resurgence, thanks in no small part to this generation. But perhaps more than any other group, the greatest recession hit the baby boomers hardest. They've lost more earning power than any other group. Their retirement savings and home values fell sharply at the worst possible time, just before they needed to cash out. Many took Social Security early, reducing their benefits by up to 30%. They've struggled with unemployment longer than younger workers. Here in New York, we've got to do more to help the members of this generation find work by giving them the skills they need for the 21st century economy. We've also got to confront the demographic challenges they present. I say they, but I present, right? In 1950, only 7.7% of New York City's population was made up of people 65 or older. But in the next 3 decades, this group will swell by more than 400,000. That's an increase of 41%. By then, nearly 1 in 6 New Yorkers will enter what some call the senior years, but which I, as a boomer, call the age of infinite wisdom. And I'm not alone. According to a recent survey, the typical boomer believes old age doesn't start till 72. No, it's really true, but think about what that says. Now, you can bet your bottom dollar that in 10 years we'll all be back here saying 72 is the new 50. Right? But in all seriousness, if we want this generation to age in place, and that's the point of this conference, we have to keep people in New York, we need to marshal every ounce of that infinite wisdom to meet their needs. And that includes everything from transportation improvements and affordable housing to flexible work arrangements and retirement security. Now, my office has already begun to plan for the challenges ahead. When it comes to transportation, we need to make city streets and sidewalks safer for an aging population. In recent years, seniors have accounted for over 1/3 of pedestrian deaths, despite making up only 12% of the population. We all know about pedestrian fatalities on Manhattan's Upper West Side and Brooklyn and other areas, many involving seniors, and we can't wait any longer to institute changes. We need to lower speed limits, we need to change the timing of traffic and crosswalk signals, and we have to install more audible signals. So a lot of the technology has to be put in place. I support Vision Zero and a lot of what the mayor is trying to accomplish, and I give City Hall great credit for driving this discussion. But it's also time to be proactive and make it clear to the drivers that there's human life out there. We have a large senior population, and we have a lot of young babies out there. So part of it is education. And our office is going to work even harder on Vision Zero. Now, as for housing, we recently published a major report showing that New York City is woefully behind other parts of the country in providing affordable housing for seniors. We found that median rents in New York City rose by 75% between 2000 and 2012, much higher than the rest of the nation. The harshest consequences have been felt by households earning less than $40,000 a year, and seniors make up a growing percentage of this group. Now, one of the things that we have to recognize is so many of our communities back in the day were not places where people necessarily wanted to live or where government would invest. A lot of the seniors today were the pioneers in a different era building up our communities. They built the schools, the daycare centers, quality of life. Think about it. Public housing residents, Mitchell-Lama residents, the people in rent control, the rent-stabilized apartments, they were pioneers, created this amazing city that we have today. But at the moment in their life where their work or the first phase of their work is done, they're the ones who are being pushed out of the neighborhoods. Now, skylines change. I know this when I was borough president. But they should change with the view that pioneers stay so they can enjoy what they built, and we welcome new people who reinvigorate our neighborhoods. We must have it both ways. That is the challenge here. And New York needs to come up with a comprehensive housing plan that is all-encompassing, using the ability to go to Albany and change rent laws, but also creating the next generation of what I think should be Mitchell-Lama housing or Mitchell-Lama 2. New York City needs to adopt more flexible work schedules so employees can adjust their hours to take care of aging family members. A lot of folks are getting older, and their children's turn is to help take care of them. But the kids are running into trouble because they can't get that flexibility. So they can't take care of their own kids. How are they going to take care of their parents or their grandparents? Now, we recently issued another report that said that 1 in 5 workers here provide some form of elder care. 1 in 5 are taking care of an elder, which I think is terrific. And that number is obviously going to increase as the boomers continue to age. More than 65% of caregivers say they need to shift their arrival of departure times from work to take care of a loved one. So think about flexibility. 1 hour in the morning, a half hour at night takes care of a whole generation of New Yorkers. So we want businesses to embrace flex time policies. We want to introduce the concept of right to request so that you can sit down with an employer and have a conversation, a safe space so you can discuss flexible work hours. We're not dictating today to business. We're simply saying, let's have a conversation given all the statistical data we now know about work and your personal life. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about retirement security for people after they leave the workforce. Today, 59% of New Yorkers lack access to a retirement plan, and we need to strengthen the retirement safety net. And that means maximizing the financial independence of baby boomers who will be retiring in large numbers and living longer. We've got to create more savings options and give all New Yorkers the opportunity to plan for their future. So we recently announced in the Comptroller's office that our new Chief Investment Officer, Scott Evans, will head a new advisory panel on retirement security this fall. These are just some of the challenges that the baby boomer generation has before it. And I just want to put one plug in. The goal here is for those who are getting older to enjoy the great city of New York. They will never be happy anywhere else. Nobody wants to go to Iowa, right? The Florida thing is way exaggerated. And every time you see a retirement community opening up somewhere in the Midwest, we New Yorkers know we're going to do everything we can not to go there, right? So nobody wants to leave New York with the culture, the arts, the history, the neighborhood, the diversity. We're a model UN in this city, 170 different languages from 200 countries. A lot of boomers say, I want to learn a second language. You don't have to go to class. You can just walk down the streets of our city and learn about different cultures. So we've got the infrastructure that says stay in New York City. The challenge for us is we have to adapt that infrastructure and change policies so that we can create an opportunity for everybody to be here. Lastly, this is not just about catering to the aging population, though we're not aging. This is about also understanding the mix between keeping families together, keeping folks who have been part of communities together, and I think that actually inspires the millennials, the next generation too. They want to be close to home. They want to know that their communities and people are going to stay with them as well. So I want to thank AARP. I want to thank City and State. I actually hope that we continue to have this discussion. I believe a year from now, as we start talking about these policies with this new city government, more people are going to come out, more people are going to participate in this discussion. It's the urban planning discussion that has to happen. It's the economic discussion that has to happen for our city. And quite frankly, it's the human discussion that has to happen. I'm glad we're starting with AARP. I'm a proud member. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
At this time, I'd like to call up our next speaker to discuss the recently released report by AARP. If we can please have a round of applause.
Don't applaud until you hear what I'm going to say. My name's Becky Gillen. I'm in charge of the research center at AARP. So we do all the research on the 50 plus and our members. And this was actually a pretty exciting report. And actually, Mr. Springer and Beth told you about a lot of it, but I'm going to go over it in a little bit more detail. Okay, so I'm just going to spend a few minutes going a little bit more into the details of the research. And, why did AARP do this research? Well, we really wanted to take a snapshot of the current state of the 50-plus New York City people, and particularly the voters. And we wanted to take a research view to really learn about their challenges and opportunities. And as you know, AARP is a mission-based organization, and our goal is to really help people 50 years and older live their best lives as they age. So this report was survey was done about a year ago. We interviewed by telephone about 1,300 people in English or Spanish, the language of their choice. And we also supplemented it with other data statistics to build out the already rich consumer data. And I'm going to refer to people, boomers, alternatively sometimes 50 to 64, or seniors, people 65 plus throughout this report. So huge demographic shift. Everybody knows the globe is aging, the U.S. is aging, but it's even true in New York and New York State. So there's 500 people turning 65 in New York every year. But right in New York City, the current population of people 65 plus is 13%. It's going to grow to 16% in 16 years. And that's 40% increase. That's a huge increase in 16 years. And importantly, right now, whites are about 47% of the 65 plus, but they're only 37% of the 50 through 64. So the needs of the multicultural population are going to increase significantly because Asians and Hispanics are growing a lot more quickly in New York City than whites and African Americans. Now, Beth alluded to this. At 54%, the 50 plus were a major voting bloc in 2013, much more than the 38% of the total voting population. And basically, New York voters under 30 aren't voting as much as the 50 plus. And if you look at the bubbles, so AARP members potentially voting in an election represented about 500,000 people. But actually AARP has about 750,000 members in New York City, and that compares to the 1.1 million who voted in 2003. So the needs of New Yorkers 50 plus and AARP members can and do drive results at the polls. And in the last election, the number one issue, regardless of age, 18 to 49, 50 plus, was jobs and unemployment. The number two issue for the 50 plus was crime, and the number two issue for younger people was education. So with all that many people, the AARP Policy PPI Institute did some research using the Bureau of Labor Statistics and estimated that the total consumer spend of people 50 plus in New York City is 140 million. So total is 140 million. Of that, 50% is spent by 50 plus people. So that's a huge $70 billion. And importantly, 40% of that is from African Americans, Hispanics, and Asians. So 35% of the 50 through 64-year-old workers who are confident about retirement report a strong likelihood to leave the city. That's the chart, far bar, the 35%. Beth cited the 64%, but the 35% are extremely or somewhat, they're going to extremely or very likely to leave. And there is a big difference by social classes. So the rich are less likely to leave. Actually 53% say they're probably not going to leave. The middle class, 39% are not likely to leave. And then the lower income and vulnerable, 36%. So what you have going on here, obviously, is the rich can afford to stay. The lower income and vulnerable, they may want to leave, but they really probably can't. So you have this big middle class that really can and probably will leave. And if that happens, obviously, it's two dynamics. You have a huge economic base you're going to have to replace. And then you're also creating a polarized social class that you have to deal with. So 50 plus voters in the AARP survey, what do they feel strongly that elected officials should work on? Well, at 81%, protect consumers from unfair and deceptive practice. Very close after that, supporting family caregivers, supporting older workers, promoting age-friendly living in New York City. Probably not a surprise. And interestingly, those top four were the same among the multicultural groups, just a slightly different order. African Americans said caregiving was their number one issue, and Asians said number two was age-friendly living. So 2/3 of the 50 through 64-year-old New York City voters are in the labor force. For many, this is the prime working years. However, this is self-reported. 14% last year said they were unemployed or unemployed looking for work. And clearly that's probably come down. The economy is starting to improve, but it's still significant. And it was even more significant among Hispanics at 19%. So, older workers are delaying retirement, especially older working women and those 75 plus. So it's probably not surprising that 48% of New York's 50 plus have experienced or witnessed age discrimination. And the number one thing they say they've seen is they're being encouraged or forced to retire. Now, age discrimination involves treating someone, either an applicant for a job or a person who's employed, less favorably due to their age. And it's particularly an issue in a weak labor force when it's hard to find a job. So, with the lagging retirement readiness, most 50-plus need to remain in the workforce just to maintain their quality of life. And actually, because they're older and they're still working, there's going to be a tendency for them to see more observations of age discrimination or experience them themselves. So it's not a surprise, again, that 72% of the New York City voters say elected officials should work on policies to support older workers. And that being 47% said it was a top priority and 25% a high priority. So this is a really important chart. There's so many people that are caregivers to loved ones. 47% of the 50 to 64-year-olds in New York are family caregivers, currently or in the past 5 years. But importantly, 52% say they probably will be a caregiver in the next 5 years. And the average caregiver is a woman in her early 50s who works outside the home and provides unpaid care to their parent. And 66% of all working caregivers feel a good deal to overwhelming strain on their life. I mean, obviously, juggling caregiving responsibilities and work is really tough. And 15% feel like they've been treated unfairly at work. And this can be combined with even feeling a sense of lack of job security and inability to get promoted, because if they miss a lot of work caring for a loved one, they're not going to be as eligible. And I don't have the statistics for New York City, but I do have it for New York State. There's about 1.4 million caregivers in the state. They provide 2.68 million hours of caregiving a year. And if you put a value on that, it's about $3.2 billion. So, among New York working 50-plus voters, only half, 25 and 25 on the top, are confident that they're going to be able to retire at some point. But a lot of them think they're going to have to work the rest of their lives. In fact, on the right, about a quarter are pretty sure that they're going to be working forever. And it's even worse among Hispanics and Asians at the bottom. They're more likely to have to work. And also, they're the groups that have the least employer-sponsored retirement plans. So, aging in place is the ability to live in one's home and community safely, independently, comfortably, regardless of age, income, or ability level. And older New Yorkers are just like older Americans nationally. They want to stay in their homes. 90% say that's a top priority. And it's not on the chart, but 26% of New Yorkers have a disability. 50 plus, but if you look at the 65 plus, it's 40%. So New York really has to address the needs of the disabled or mobility challenged in all the boroughs. Because interestingly, the most number of disabled people is in the Bronx at 48% and Brooklyn at 43%. So while more than half of 50 plus voters consider New York's lack of affordable housing to be a major problem, it's a key concern. And while that is 54% among the 50 plus, there's subgroups that view affordable housing as even a bigger issue. It's 60% among the 50 to 64 and 48% among the 65 plus. But African Americans say 59% affordable housing is a big issue. Hispanics, 67%. And people who rent their houses, don't own them in New York, it's 61% say it's an issue. And I didn't know this. I should have known this, suspected this, but most of the people in New York rent. They don't own their homes. 61% rent, 37% own, and then 2% have other accommodations. But we also can't forget heavy traffic and crime safety. Those are very important as well. So, a majority, or 61%, want to receive long-term care at home. Yet there's a gap in affordable services. Long-term care is not medical care. It's assistance with the basic everyday acts of living. And it's estimated that 70% of the 65 plus will need long-term care sometime in their elder life. Now, since New York's senior population is going to grow by 40% over the next 16 years, the city's healthcare field obviously has to look at more affordable long-term care. And while the top preference is for paid care, the second one is care from your family or loved ones. But most people that are being cared for don't want to be a burden on their families. So, and I have to remind you that long-term care is not covered by traditional health plans or Medicare. It's either you or your family who pay. And to put that in perspective, we did a calculation. If you have an aide at home who takes care of you 5 days a week, 6 hours a day for 2 years, the average cost right now in New York City is $59,000. If that person has to go into a nursing home, that 2 years of care is $322,000. Huge opportunity. So, alternative transportation. Mr. Springer talked about this. I mean, beyond affordable, accessible housing, if you want to decrease the likelihood of older people being in institutional care, I think we have to consider transportation and pedestrian mobility. And yet, when we asked the people in this study about alternate transportation in their communities, 53% said it was good, fair, or poor, and 15% just didn't know. But I will say that in 2014, it's estimated that 846,000 people will be transported by New York City's paratransit Access-A-Ride. It's a huge service, and it can only get bigger and bigger and more important. And 846,000, in perspective to the 2.6 million people, 50 plus, who live in New York City, you can see how many people. Now, you can be disabled and younger and use it too, but you can see how many people are already taking advantage of that offer. So, just eight takeaways. I'm about done. So we're talking about the 65 plus population growing to 16%, 40% growth. The 50 plus were 54% of the citywide voters in 2013, big voting bloc. They spend about $70 billion of consumer expenditures, which is about half of all consumer expenditures in the city. 35% of the 50 to 64 are working. So and those that are confident that they're going to retire are extremely or very likely to leave New York City. And the middle class is most likely to leave, so that's going to have an impact on polarization of those left. The 50-plus voters say the number one priority for elected officials should be protecting consumers from unfair or deceptive practices. 2/3 of the 50 to 64 are still in the workforce. Obviously, older workers are delaying their retirement, so they're more likely to say they're going to experience age discrimination, particularly in weak labor markets. 47% of the 50 to 64 are caregivers. Half of them are working, so they're juggling work and caregiving, and it's tough. It's a lot of stress, and there could even be an issue of job security. And the final point, 90% of people want to stay in their home as they age. But 54% here say that affordable housing is a major problem, and it's especially true among the 61% who rent their homes in New York City. So that's sort of my overview. Thank you very much. It was exciting to do this, and it was great to come here.
All right, good morning. My name's John Lentz. I'm City and State's Albany Bureau Chief, and I'm moderating a terrific panel we have here this morning. We'll be touching on most of these points, discussing them in a little more depth. Just introduce the panelists and go right into some questions. Keep in mind that we'll have a little time at the end for Q&A. So if you have any questions you want to ask, keep those in mind. Next to me, to my left, is Tom Wright, the Executive Director of the Regional Plan Association. A little tidbit there. We had some news in our first read email this morning. He'll be taking over at the Regional Plan Association. Bob Yarrow is retiring, and sometime soon you'll be taking the helm.
Very relevant for this conversation.
Next to him, Jason Bram, a research officer at the New York Federal Reserve Bank. Next to him is Mitra Baruzzi, the executive director of the 1199 SEIU Benefit and Pension Funds. And last but not least, Leslie Hirsch, director of CUNY's NYC Labor Market Information Service. And I wanted to start off with one of the key findings here. It's something everyone knows, but you have this silver tsunami. You have this population that is aging that will soon make up a much larger part of the New York City population. And so we'll go down the row, and I would like to know, within your respective areas of expertise, what are the most important ramifications of this huge demographic shift?
Sure, thanks. It's a pleasure to talk here today. We've been kind of looking at RPA, we look not just at New York City, but at the 31 county tri-state metropolitan region. And so we've been kind of tracking demographic trends and shifts for that entire region. And while New York City has, and you know, what we've seen over time is these trends kind of accelerate, as it were. As I think folks know, young people are moving into the city at increasing rates, and to some degree really pushing out the retirees and the older population. And so what we're seeing is these two kind of, as there more growth in that side, in that cohort in the population, we also have this increased pressure from below. And so we're kind of seeing these trends knock up against each other. And so I think a lot of the results of the study were not surprising to us. Affordable housing becomes a kind of key issue for folks concerned about it. Over the winter, actually, we were doing research for RPA's fourth regional plan. We've done 3 in our history, and we had a series of focus groups around the region with different age cohorts, again, kind of asking people what they thought about and what issues concern them in the future and things. And this group in particular was kind of much like the rest of the other populations, only more so. And what we saw were, again, these kind of two issues. On the one hand, people love their communities. They want to stay rooted in their community. They feel connected to it. Their family, their friends, their networks are very important to them. And that's what attracts them to this region and to the city, and that's why they want to be here. And I think elderly people really feel that they want to hold on to that. On the other hand, the finances and the strain and the stress that they feel, and the numbers bear these out. Over the last 10 years, 3/4 of the population has seen their median income decline. More people are paying a higher percentage of their household income for housing than ever before, higher for this region than other parts of the nation. And so there's all this kind of financial stress on people that's pushing them and forcing them out. And I think, again, as the study showed, it's really that kind of middle group economically that finds itself trying to make a trade-off between stretching the dollar on the one hand and wanting to be in the community and making that choice to leave. And so that's become the real concern that we found ourselves looking at.
Jason?
Okay. Should I turn it on now?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
Does that work? Yes. So I agree with a lot of the things that have been said here. I think, as would happen with any segment of the population that has different needs, as that segment grows, policy has to respond in many different ways to accommodate that fact. And so, for example, I think I kind of agree with the controller that I don't really consider 50 to 65 as being all that aged, me being in that group. But, I think there are a lot of people over 65 that I think the people that need to be focused on are, I know it was mentioned it was $100 billion market or so forth. I don't think it's the people with the millions and billions that are really you need to be concerned about keeping here. Because as, if someone with, who's a millionaire decides they want to retire to Florida, you're not going to stop them. Good luck and all. And they're going to be replaced by someone else who wants to live in New York. If you're in a city like, there are a lot of cities like Detroit, Buffalo, where when people leave, it's a real drain on the economy. It reduces the tax base, it reduces the potential of basically the city to cope. New York City, luckily, is not in that situation. Lots and lots of people want to come to New York. So I think the focus, and where the ramifications and the focus of policy, insofar as what we call the senior population go, should be those who are, most in need, those who maybe want to stay but can't, and whatever can be done. I should add also that the city is doing an awful lot. I think often the city is underappreciated. I looked at the American Community Survey that's done by the census. About 80% of senior renters are in regulated housing. And so they're kind of at least a little bit protected from the market and so forth. And just to close out, because I don't want to ramble on too long, I think a lot of the issues that we're talking about that affect the 50 and over and the 65 and over are issues that affect the population generally. And they're of pretty much concern to everyone. So to me, what you said earlier, which was the ramifications for the middle class, I think are very important, because people will leave. Some people will leave, and contrary to what the controller says, I do know people who are here and they're like, the moment they retire, they want to be out of New York. I don't get it. But there are some people who just want to go to Florida or wherever, and God bless them. But I know for the people who want to stay, I think it is important to look at the ramifications for the middle class, because income inequality is a big issue in New York City, and anything that exacerbates that is something I think is of concern. So I'm going to end there.
So I guess the folks that I'm here representing, our members, are among the lucky ones. They receive defined benefit pension benefits when they retire, and that means they receive a set monthly amount that they can calculate, they can plan their retirement, they can figure out what they will be receiving every month in addition to Social Security. And that puts them in a solid 20% of people in this country who have defined benefit pension plans. I think a lot of people still think about retirement and they think about pensions and they think about monthly payments, but that's really only true for a small minority of people anymore. When you include public employees, it rises to 28%, but that's it. For the vast majority of Americans, there is no defined monthly payout. So having said that, my members are among the lucky ones. Let me qualify that a little bit. We have 3 different pension funds that cover 3 different parts of the healthcare industry, and the largest fund covers workers who work in hospitals, not-for-profit nursing homes, and some of the other not-for-profit areas. They're sort of the middle class, I guess, among those to whom we provide benefits, and their average benefit is $855 a month. Added to, an about equivalent amount of Social Security benefits, that puts them solidly under 200% of the poverty level, like 50% of Medicare beneficiaries in this country, right? So even the lucky ones are not wealthy by a long stretch. They're not among those for whom it's easy to stay in New York. And by the way, that's only among the lucky members that I have for our nursing home members in a separate fund. Their average monthly benefit is about $500. And for home care workers, and we probably have the only home care workers who receive any kind of defined benefit pension in the entire country, oh, this is embarrassing to say, their average benefit is $76 a month. It was supposed to be a start 20 years ago when the union won a pension benefit for home care workers, but funding for that industry has not kept pace. That ties to the other thing that I'd like to say, which is that I'm a family caregiver, a woman over 50, taking care of my mother while I work full time, and my husband probably does more of the work than I do, but between the two of us with our jobs and wanting to have a life besides that, we rely heavily on paid caregivers. All of us, no matter how hard we try to care for our families, and there are so many people who don't have families here or don't, never had children or whatever, we all need there to be a strong home care workforce, right? And with $76 pension as their reward for working their rear ends off for many years, or a $10 wage, which, by the way, is the product largely of city and state policies that have required at least a $10 wage plus contributions toward health care plus contributions toward pensions. That's a lot better than home care workers were doing before or are doing in places that are not covered by New York City's and states' laws or by union contracts. But is that really going to keep a talented, compassionate, hardworking person in that job when Hopefully, one day fast food will pay $15 an hour, right? So as we are paying attention to income inequality generally, in particular when it comes to the aging population, I think we really need to value the paid caregivers. I think that's the best support for the unpaid caregivers among us, right? We really need to value them. We really need to look at workforce policies that will support maintaining a strong home care workforce.
Thank you, AARP, for having us here today. It's a great conversation. I, too, am an over 50 caregiver of my family working full-time. So I want to add to, I think, what a lot of us have been automatically coming to, which is that a lot of the issues that we've been discussing today are issues for public policy. I couldn't agree more, coming from the background that I come from, which is political science and public policy and government. But I also think that we need to start thinking about what the private sector responses are, and instead of thinking of what can the government do for us, also what can we as a group 50 and over do for the government to improve our own well-being in our own neighborhoods and to contribute to the well-being of the city. When I say private sector, I don't just mean us. I mean, of course, firms. And I'll tell you what I'm talking about in just a moment. So I'm going to just build on the comments I think that just about everybody here said, which is if it's happening to the 50 and over, chances are it's a much larger trend in the labor market or the economy. So in New York City, what we've seen is what's been called the hollowing out of our labor market or of our economy, with an awful lot of middle-skill jobs sort of evaporating. Everyone knows manufacturing shrunk a long time ago, but an awful lot of other jobs that would have been for people with more than a high school diploma but less than a bachelor's degree, they're really shrinking. And what's really booming are these very low-paid jobs with low skill requirements or low educational attainment requirements. And low-paying jobs, of course, and also the very high-paying and high-skilled jobs. So we've been talking about tech boom, we've been talking about advertising, management consulting. These are areas that are really, really growing and very healthy in New York City. But the stuff that's in the middle, that may be part of the reason why we're not seeing people stay who are in the middle, because the people in the middle can't make the kind of money they used to make. Unless they go back to school, and a lot of us at age 50 and over who have family caregiving responsibilities may not have time to do that. I also think we're also talking about rising educational requirements for those jobs that do pay well. So not only are they high educational requirements, but they're getting higher. A lot of times in healthcare, people call that credential creep. Used to see an awful lot of associate degree nurses in most hospitals, from what I understand, and you can verify this if it's true. I believe right now it's almost impossible to get a job as a nurse if you don't have a BSN. And so there are also rising technological requirements to jobs. Everybody's likes to talk about all the tech startups, but really what's happened is a much, much quieter but much larger transformation of our economy, much, much bigger than, when we all started having to use WordPerfect and floppy disks, which I know I can say in this crowd. So, so I love that. What we're really talking about now is having all kinds of coding savvy, data analytics, being facile with a computer with mobile devices, being able to handle a mobile workforce. And it's not just the job of a few, it's the job of everyone. And so what we're seeing here is this really, really difficult period right now where we, as the people who have institutional knowledge in our fields, may or may not have the technological skills, may or may not have the latest educational training because we've been at it so long, but we bring real value to the workplace. And an awful lot of us over 50 don't want to retire. As Controller Stringer said, 50, well, now 50 is the new what? The new 30? It used to be the new 40, but now 50 is the new 30. And soon 72 will be the new, or 75 will be the new 50. So I think what the private sector is right now grappling with is how to put us in a blender basically together to make the ultimate employee, one that really knows how the business works, has the institutional knowledge, has the relationships, but has the technological savvy and the latest training. And it's not happening. And so, we can't be blended together. We can try to have more mentoring in the workplace. We can try to make some real efforts to have succession planning so that you're shadowing your younger workers or shadowing your older workers. But it's not happening as much as it could be happening, and it's pretty difficult. They're also coupled with this a lot of, once, I think as everybody mentioned already, just as likely to be unemployed, those of us who want to stay in the labor force, as anyone else, controlling for, of course, education and race and so forth. But we are a lot more likely to stay unemployed longer. So right now, the average number of weeks for people who are unemployed, even though our rate is down, the average number of weeks is still pretty high. It's still up there in the high 40s, which is close to historic highs. So it was at its historic high in 2010. So we're getting better, but we're still much more likely to be unemployed. And what's the reason for this? A, the things that we just talked about, technological skills, educational attainment, those are real. And private business has every right to ask what it wants of its workforce. But there are other things at play. There are a lot of perceptions of this population, us and people who are older than us, meaning the 65 and older, that we are only working because we have to, because our retirements ran out. Not true, not for all of us. Some of us really want to. That we are less energetic, not true. That we aren't up to date. Again, may or may not be true. We've been working at it. We have all these great relationships. There are a number of other reasons why healthcare costs. They think that you're going to be more rigid, more expensive. You're going to drive their prices up, their insurance prices up. These are all things that really need to be dealt with out in the open. There are associational biases now. We know now, research studies have shown that people who are 50 and over, all other things being equal, are half as likely to be hired with the same background, the same education, are half as likely to be hired as those under 50. So I think that's another one of those private sector, larger issues, not necessarily public policy. And I'll wrap up. One other thing I think that we talked about, the higher end and the high technological skills, the lower end, and this is where a lot of us really work, because a lot of New Yorkers work there, right? Home health, huge, highest growing, just astronomically growing industry in our economy right now, in the labor market in New York City and generally. Food service, education. These are all areas that are somewhat low paid or, start at entry level. Retail, another one, is another really big area. Believe it or not, we would have thought it's all the 30s or the 16 to 24s who are in retail. We're in retail too, in big numbers. So the other thing, going back now to the public policy piece, is not only do we need to be protecting people in the workplace, but we ought to be thinking about raising that floor. We've been talking a lot about minimum wage. Let's make it happen. And in addition to those and other supports, we can keep people who are in those jobs and able to afford their living here.
Well, I'd just like to note that I'm 32 years old, so I guess that's a new 20.
16, right?
16, right. But building on what you were saying, one of the most striking things I found in this report is that for those ages 50 to 64, that's often your prime working years, when you're making the most money, and you tie that with what you're talking about, that so many people are out of work, you have much higher unemployment rates, and you touched on some of this. What can be done there? How do we address this issue?
Well, I think what you were saying was that we have higher unemployment rates. We actually don't have higher unemployment rates at this age. It's the longer duration of unemployment. And, I think, first of all, just making people aware and fighting these associational biases are the most important thing. I also think that making some of the workplace accommodations, this is exactly what the AARP report rightly points out, is, accommodations reasonable accommodations can be made for us because we are just like you. And not only are we caring for older people, but we're also caring for younger people. There are plenty of grandparents here who have primary caregiving responsibility for children right now in New York City. In fact, we are overrepresented. Not me, but we as an older group are overrepresented in the country. So accommodations for family care beyond what we have right now with family leave.
I'll just point out, kind of recognizing some of the financial stress that's put on people in that period. Again, as you point out, that should be the kind of peak earning period in a person's career, and so to be out of work during that time is going to be kind of doubly difficult. Also, just kind of looking at some of the other larger economic trends that we have again in this city and region, especially actually if you get outside New York City and you talk to people about their finances, what are they concerned about? It's property taxes. Property taxes are a major issue in Long Island, Connecticut, New Jersey has the highest in the nation. And property taxes have been increasing well above the rate of inflation and incomes and other things. And at least when you're in your 30s or 40s, you can kind of look at that, and if you have children going to a public school, you know that's picking up about half that tab. Okay, so there's some payback, but when you're at when you don't have children in the school systems, when you might be more on a fixed income, then those property taxes are going to be doubly bad. Likewise, I'd say the interest rate environment. For somebody who's looking to borrow a lot of money and buy a house, you're very grateful for those very low interest rates. But if you are, again, stuck on some kind of fixed income that's going to be tied to that, you are really going to be suffering through that. So there are these larger trends that I think hit this population harder. And I think that kind of recognizing those aren't remedies I'm putting out, I'm afraid, but just to kind of understand that there are those larger trends that exacerbate a lot of these issues.
One more point. I did want to point out that AARP and the American Association of Community Colleges run some really fantastic workforce programs to get people back into the workforce or attached to the labor market. And so I think right now, if I'm not mistaken, 7 of CUNY's community colleges have fairly large programs serving the 50 and over. And what they're doing now is not just doing, the regular resume writing and, how to dress and interview and that kind of thing and giving you a job placement, but doing the kinds of supports that you're talking about, connecting you to financial supports, doing financial counseling, providing psychotherapy, for example, for people, because an awful lot of us who become unemployed for a very long period of time become depressed. And so there are some promising practices out there, and they are public and private combined. So I think that something like that we ought to think about as a model for larger action.
And just very quickly, to add on to that, earlier it was noted, and I think quite correctly, that age discrimination, to the extent that it's irrational, or maybe in some cases, you could say, well, they want someone with less healthcare, expenses or so forth, whatever. To whatever it is the reason, a tighter, stronger labor market will make it much less prevalent because, if you're an employer and let's just say you have an irrational bias against older people, and you have some younger candidates and older candidates, you're going to discriminate. Once you're like looking desperately for someone to fill that job, and someone 58 comes along and they're good, you're going to take them. So I think just the general strength of the economy, and in a sense, New York City in the last few years has actually been doing better than most of the nation in terms of the economy. But as the economy gets stronger and the labor market gets tighter, at least that aspect of it should improve.
I also think it's important to recognize that continuing to work beyond whatever age should be able to be a choice and not an economically driven necessity. Yesterday I had lunch with a woman who turned out to be, I was shocked, 79. That's the new 60, really. I was quite impressed. And she's continuing to work because she loves her work and she wants to work. And then we have home care workers who work into their 80s because they have to. because they have no other economic option. And so I think we really, I touched on how our members are lucky because lots of people don't have workplace-based retirement plans, but let's do something about that, And there are actually proposals out there. I know the Controller's Office has been looking at them for so-called guaranteed retirement accounts that are public sort of pools that individuals through their employers could be required to participate in at no cost necessarily to the employer. It could be all contributory from the employee at no cost to the public, no taxpayer dollars, but the money would be pooled. And actually I was struck by, the comment about how you're in your highest earning years, potentially, from 50 to 64, but things like the interest rate environment adversely affect you. Well, certainly, if you have an individual retirement account, a 401k, which is what the majority of people who have any kind of retirement plan at work have, your assets have to be more conservatively invested as you get closer to retirement, and you're getting bupkis on your dollars, right? When you should be getting the most. Whereas if you are in a pooled account, and that's one of the advantages of a defined benefit plan, or this kind of public pooled plan, then the assets continue to be collectively invested as aggressively as prudently, but aggressively as possible. So I think that's the kind of, bigger picture thinking that we need to do about retirement income security.
And I wanted to move on to this question of older New Yorkers leaving New York City. But before that, I wanted to build on something you were talking about, retirement benefits. This was also very striking to me as I read this. I think for seniors 65 plus, according to AARP, just about 1/4 have retirement income, such as pensions or employer-sponsored plans. 3/4 receive Social Security. But statewide, the average yearly Social Security benefit was just about $16,000. Some other, facts here that really stood out. More than 1/3 of New York City households in which the head is near retirement age have liquid assets of less than $10,000. As well, and I think we were talking about this the other day, Mitra, you have the story from the New York Times about the pension funds here in the city and the problems trying to keep those funded. So you have all these things coming together. How do seniors cope? Or what are the ramifications of this as well?
I do want to take the opportunity to talk about the challenges. While I said it's a good idea to let more people into these sort of group investment accounts that can produce a sort of an annuity-like benefit, it is a challenge to maintain them, particularly with market volatility. Let's not forget 2008. But the growing number of retirees is an issue that we all have to be willing to put resources into. It's not necessarily a waste of public dollars to support people in retirement, right? Yes, there are more people who are getting older. I mean, just to use as an example, 10 years ago we had 50,000 retirees receiving benefits. Last year we had 85,000. That's a 70% increase over the last 10 years, with 10,000 of the additional 35,000 coming just in the last 2 years. Our union and our employers sit down and collectively bargain what the contribution rate needs to be. Of course, our assets are professionally managed and we expect reasonable returns. But the workers decide, well, I want to divert some more of the money that would otherwise be available for wages to plan for my retirement. The employers say, I want a workforce that feels secure and feels like it has a choice to work or not. So, yeah, some more money might have to go into the retirement side of the equation. I think that's like a reality check that we need. It's not just like, the looming disaster of pension funds. It's, no, you really do need to invest in retirement security.
I mean, is part of that possibly raising the retirement age?
That's one of the potential solutions. I will tell you, though, that in that the large fund, our sort of middle class fund, where we have an unreduced early retirement, the normal retirement age is 65, and we have an unreduced early retirement benefit available at age 62 with 20 years of service. In that fund, overall, the average retirement age is 63 and a half. So you could do that. You could, delay the time when people could start receiving benefits, but then the benefits might have to be a little higher if they're not going to be able to take another job, which I assume a lot of these folks who are retiring at this age are doing. So, you push down on one side, it kind of comes up somewhere else. It's like proposals to raise the age of Medicare eligibility. It's not that you're not going to spend the money. It's going to be spent someplace else. People need health care, or they'll be sicker by the time they get to Medicare, right? So it's a little, it could be penny-wise and pound-foolish, but, I'm not saying that it shouldn't be done. It's just that, you might have to compensate for it in some other way.
All right, and then moving on to the question of older New Yorkers leaving New York City. The comptroller said nobody wants to go to Iowa. I'm actually from Nebraska, so I take issue with that.
Are you still there?
But I'm here, right, I'm here. However, there was another New York Times article out recently about not just older New Yorkers, but many people leaving the coasts, going to the center of the country. You have cheaper real estate. You can afford a home, things like that. And taking that with all these other issues we've talked about with older New Yorkers, all these challenges they face, is it a real concern that you have a lot of people potentially being pushed out and leaving this sort of hole in the middle class?
I'll start, I guess. I'll start. I should say, by the way, the comments, my opinions and all are mine and not those of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or the Federal Reserve System, in case I say something. So I think that, am I worried about people leaving from the point of view of the tax base or because it's a big market? I'm not, no. And the reason I'm not is that, again, New York is a place in very high demand. I mean, one of the reasons there's no affordable housing, one reason that housing affordability is a big problem is because so many people do want to be here. It's not because people are leaving. Housing is very affordable in many cities in the Midwest, cities like Detroit, cities like Cleveland, and the reason it's affordable is because people are leaving. So, all right, I just wanted to get that. I mean, to some extent, there's the sort of supply and demand issue. So when you say, are you concerned about people leaving? What I am concerned about, though, is as everyone else is saying, is people who can't stay, who want to stay, and who have family ties and other connections to New York. You kind of like to help them. You can't. I mean, obviously, everyone with limited income, you have to make trade-offs and choices. But it's a very fundamental, issue where you live. And then, of course, I think the middle class is also a very significant issue because it's within the working age population, there's become growing polarization in terms of jobs. Economists go on. There's many different views that all have some merit of why it's happening, what's causing it. But I think most people agree that it's a concern and a problem. And so if you then, in addition to people in the middle class jobs not being there, if in addition you have people who are kind of in the middle in terms of wealth, if those tend to be the people who are leaving, that just exacerbates the issue. So I'm not so concerned about the number of people leaving, but it is important to maintain a diverse and complete mix of New Yorkers.
Yeah, I would kind of, from the urban planning perspective, second that in many ways. I mean, what's very important is that our communities remain diverse, that we have young people and middle-aged people and elderly people able to live in all of our communities, and that we have people at the low, median, and high end of the economic scale able to live in our communities. And so the concerns we have are when trends start to kind of limit choices, especially for people kind of either on the upper or the lower end of the age brackets or the lower end in the income levels. And we do see kind of pressure, and this is what the housing markets again reflect, and travel modes and mobility patterns and other things. We can kind of tend to see these things happen. I mean, it's a little interesting just to dig into numbers, because we look at this on a kind of county by county basis. Ocean County in New Jersey is the only county, and it's the southernmost part of this region, it's the only one that consistently gains in the over 50 population within the tri-state region. But Manhattan lost about twice as many people in this cohort, in the 50 plus, from 1990 to 2000 that it did from 2000 to 2010. So there's been a great reduction in the number of folks in the 50 and over cohort moving out in the last 10 years than there were previously. What we're still seeing though now is, I mean, again, there's got to be room for these enormous influx of these 18 to 32-year-olds or so that are just driving things. And that's where the housing production really is just not keeping up. And I do worry about, about the supply and the prices pricing out more and more middle-income communities. And so figuring out ways to provide more housing for these folks is going to be a real critical issue. I mean, this is what the comptroller talked about. I think it's housing, and then again, it's mobility and how people get around, and understanding that one of the advantages we do have here is that you don't need to have a car for every single driver, and that there are other ways to get around. But we're at risk of backsliding on that, quite candidly. I mean, right now, we're in a situation where the MTA's capital plan does not include many of the kind of quality of life upgrades that we would see in other parts of the world for a modern metro system. In the rest of the world, they build glass doors on the platforms to provide safety and make it more comfortable. Those are really critical in other parts of the world. Here, we think that that's just a kind of frivolous add-on that we don't need, and we think it's okay that once a week somebody dies on the tracks of the subways. And so the MTA doesn't include that in their capital plan, and their capital plan is only half funded. And if we don't keep maintaining our subway system, we will go back to the days of cars catching fire and derailing and other things. And that will be, especially again for the younger population and the elderly population, that will be an enormous difficulty. So we have to worry about those things.
I want to add on to that, the MTA discussion, that actually urban transit is among the oldest industries in New York City in terms of the median age of the workforce and the percent who are over 55. It's really pretty astounding. It was a great article in the Times, I want to say last October, about the recovery from Sandy and how the so-called old-timers in the MTA, this is exactly the right example for what I was talking about, knew how to build on the fly the kind of barriers that needed to be built at the Whitehall station so that the R line wasn't flooded from Manhattan all the way to Brooklyn and so forth. And what's going to happen when those old-timers are gone? We're not replacing them. And we're not attracting the kind of young workers because of the attitude that I think, I hate to say, a lot of us, public at large, really love our subway. But when we hear about transit workers wanting raises or, negotiating with the mayor, or with the board up in Albany, we think, oh boy, subway service really, lousy and they don't deserve it, and why are they always asking for money? I don't get more money, but the truth of the matter is you are going to have this issue, not only with an investment, without an investment in the infrastructure, but also without an investment in that workforce. It's very, very important. And we always were, before the FDR administration, we always were the city that experimented and had those kind of social amenities that made life easier for people who were having a harder time, that made, we had, I'd love to think that we used to have the greatest public transit in the world. Definitely not true anymore. And I think that's another, certainly another issue. Getting back to your question about population flight, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure it's true what you found in the study, but I know IBO recently did a study because all these high-profile people were saying, "I'm leaving New York City because the taxes are too high." And the fact of the matter is that they were less like the high-income people were less likely to leave. Just as you said, because they can afford to stay, right? I think it's like the out-migration rate is about 1.8% or something like that. So that's how many of the really, really wealthy left. And it's just the same percentage pretty much across the board. When we were talking about losing the middle class, I think we're talking about the people, I can't speak to out-migration of the middle class. I can say that if you were a middle-skill person, you're not going to find a job that will keep you in the middle class. And so unless you're moving up or moving away, you're moving down, right, in the amount of money you're making. So I think those were the main points. But I do agree with Jason that people with money leave and people with money come back. We have a constant cycle, the best and the brightest. How many of you have noticed how everybody seems to be 25 when you're walking on the streets of Midtown Manhattan? They come from all over the country and all over the world, indeed. And one of the reasons why we aren't as aging as fast as, say, Tokyo or other major global cities in the world is because we have the in-migration, but especially we have the immigration. And we have very, very young immigration. So I wouldn't be as worried about losing them, us.
So we have enough of a cohort of retirees in Florida that once a year we go down, some of the staff and leadership, we go down and we have a banquet and we talk to them all and help them if they have issues with we provide retiree health coverage or if they have issues with their pensions, things like that. And I have noticed a demographic shift over the 10 years in that group. It used to be more, sort of white New York, right? And now it's becoming much more Caribbean New York that we see in that group. And so I hadn't really thought about it statistically. It's just like, oh, it's March. Okay, it's time to go down to Florida and say hi to our retirees. But, looking at this report, made me go back and look at our numbers. So of our 85,000 retirees, 35,000 of them are outside of New York City. Outside of New York State. And those are people who made their livings here, right, and earned those pensions here. And it's consistent with your findings. It's our middle class group, our big pension fund that has, they migrate out earliest. We didn't get rates of out-migration, but they migrate out earliest because really home care workers and those nursing home workers are poorer and probably can't afford to leave. But I think that we can't assume that because we know those two facts, the number and their relative economic status, that we understand everything about it. Because anecdotally, before I looked at the numbers, what I got when I went down there and we talked with retirees was that they were returning to community. That's where family members lived, or neighborhoods in Florida that are increasingly densely populated with not only Caribbean Americans, but Caribbean Americans from St. Lucia. Particular, very concentrated communities. We have other than Florida, the state with the next highest concentration is it's around 1,000 is North Carolina, and again, that's returning to community, returning to extended families. So there may be other factors, other choices at play, not all negative, not all something you're able to do something about or can do something about. So I think it would be important to kind of drill down, dig beneath that to see what are the drivers of outmigration that are the bad ones that, we could try to do something about with policies to keep people.
I just want to add one clarification point. When you look at half, let's say the survey is accurate and half the people, and not only accurate in terms of being representative, but accurate in terms of the people who say they're going to move actually do move. So your first impression is, wow, half the people are going to leave. How will we survive? And yet, the population projections show that group growing. And so it's important to keep in mind the difference between what we call gross migration and net migration. And so you're going to have a lot of people who retire, who move out, and I know people who in their 50s and 60s are moving into New York. And so there's always this sort of churning. And so you have to look at sort of both sides of the equation. And a lot of the people who are moving in have spent like much of their lives in the suburbs. They get to be 60, 65, whatever. And, they're not the people who want to go to Florida. They're the people who say, gee, I kind of like New York now that we only need a one-bedroom apartment instead of a three-bedroom apartment. Maybe we can actually afford to live here. Again, you have the same issue with the middle class, but you do have that both ways, sort of what we call churning.
Well, I just think that's an important point to jump on. Many of the same things that have made New York so attractive to other cohorts and populations also make it attractive. And essentially, other than the weather issue, we're really competitive in a lot of these in a lot of these ways, and growing more so in terms of culture and all the other amenities and attractions that we have, and kind of investing in and maintaining and keeping ahead on those issues is probably really important for the city and the region.
Sure, and shifting gears a little bit, Beth earlier said this population is an uber voting group. They, make up a huge portion of how many people actually vote each year. And so I wanted to touch on some things that are being done by elected officials. You talked about transportation, you talked about the subways. You do have de Blasio's Vision Zero, which addresses some of these concerns, trying to improve safety. The report also talked about paid sick leave and how that's been expanded. That's a key issue for a lot of seniors. There was an increase, an 8% bump in funding this year for the Department of the Aging in New York City. So there are these things. Affordable housing, that's another key de Blasio initiative. To what degree is this voting power translating into real action? To what degree are these things, making real changes? What more do you expect here?
If I could talk about the Vision Zero for folks who aren't aware of that terminology, the comptroller talked about it and his support for it too, and I personally, and I can speak for an organization professionally, do also. This is a kind of concept borrowed from Sweden about trying to drive down traffic fatalities and pedestrian fatalities to zero. Keep in mind that last year you had almost the same likelihood of dying by being hit by a truck or a bus or a car or a train as you did by being murdered. And think about, it's a little bit higher, the murder rate, but pretty much very close. And think about the industry, the entire public safety, what happens every time a person is murdered in this city, what the resources we put behind figuring out what happened, catching the perpetrator, bringing them to justice, doing this, and then think about what happens. Maybe somebody gets a parking ticket or a speeding ticket or something, and that's about it. And of course, the victims of those crimes, really, of traffic fatalities, tend to be the young children or the elderly retirees. It's skewed heavily towards those. And so, putting more attention on this, Police Commissioner Bratton has publicly stated he thinks that we can drive down those numbers the same way we did historically on crime in New York. And the de Blasio administration is putting an enormous amount of resources. Speed limits are coming down. Again, just reducing the speed of a vehicle that hits somebody by 5 miles an hour dramatically increases the likelihood that you'll survive that accident. Enforcing these laws, of course, enforcing them against bicyclists who go the wrong way also is important. But there's an enormous amount of attention and focus being given to this really for the first time, I think, ever. And I think that it is responding to some of this voting power. And I think it's also just kind of responding to the fact that people are suddenly waking up and realizing that what's going on has not been okay. And that it's not like the weather, that there's nothing you can do about it. There is something we could do about this. And I think that that's really appropriate.
So I don't know these senior voters as a block. I know them as our retirees whose mantra when they retire, they get T-shirts and hats that say retired but active. And because they have a connection to the political process other than just, elected officials reaching out to them or, seeing things on TV through their union, not us, not the entity that pays their benefits, but the 1199, the union, that not all of them, but the large number who remain involved are quite active. And I have to say that to me, the stereotype of the self-interested senior voter really doesn't apply because they live in communities. They're caring for their grandchildren, as you pointed out. They are their children are working in the institutions that they left. They're not on Medicaid, our members, because they are on Medicare or they have their early retiree health benefits, but they fight to maintain Medicaid funding because they recognize the importance of that to the health of their communities and the institutions where their children or their neighbors or whatever are working and providing health care to all New Yorkers. So I'm sure there are, people who sort of just sit in front of their TV and say, oh, I don't like that, that affects me badly. But I think there's really a lot more going on with people who are in fact retired, who have time to pay attention to issues, who are connected to the political process through organizations, through, other kinds of affiliations that give them a broader and very compassionate, I think, view of good public policy.
All right, and I think we could go on, but I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. And if you could go to the mic, line up, and first state your name, try to keep it brief, make it a question, not a statement.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ed Brady. I live on the Upper East Side. It's a shame that our controller left early, but I'd like to make a suggestion, put in my invariable 2 cents here. I'm so glad that you pointed out about the transportation aspect. Here is my proposal. For the island of Manhattan, and we can use this as a beta test, with the exception of cops, fire, and ambulance, no more combustion vehicles on the island of Manhattan. Now, I know that may sound a bit silly and a little inane, but I know that there, and you probably know better than I, that there are places around this world, Amsterdam, Portland, Oregon, light rail, people movers. These things can be implemented within weeks. Now, God knows with the political aspect in this city, all sorts of things need to be accomplished. But I'd like to hear your views on implementing something along those lines. You want to talk about keeping, especially the older people here, that would be the way to do it, to make the streets safer. Again, there's a lot of caveats with that, but let's make 57th Street a boulevard. Park Avenue a real boulevard. I think that's something that really could be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. You want to go first?
I'll be quick. I mean, I don't think it's a realistic thing, frankly. A lot of I would say most of the people I know that use vehicles, especially during the day in New York City, tend to be middle class, construction people, plumbers, people who live in places that aren't. Now, you could, if the transportation system, not only in New York City, but throughout the United States, or at least throughout this region of the United States, were more complete, kind of like a Swedish city, say, you might be able to start thinking. Even then, I don't think you could do all of Manhattan. That's my view. I think the regional plan association has a much better handle on this.
I'm much more bullish on your proposal.
I thought you would be.
No, I mean, we're moving. I mean, I think that the wonderful DOT commissioner we had, Jeanette Sadik-Khan, really moved us aggressively in this direction in the Bloomberg administration, and this is one that the de Blasio administration is going for, and that's a vision. And before we kind of throw it out, there are some very concrete, tangible steps that we should be taking now to keep doing that, creating more, building on the pedestrian environment and creating more boulevards. Look, the simplest and most obvious thing we ought to do, and we should have done it a couple years ago, was starting to charge people to drive into Manhattan. Congestion charging, it's called. We'll call it something better, fare tolling or something else like that. It's been done in London, in Stockholm, in Singapore, and it works. And you can figure out how to make sure that that the burden doesn't fall on any one specific population. You can tailor it, of course, in many of those cities. They provide incentives for low-emission vehicles, so they don't have to pay the same amount or other things like that. But it's a way of generating substantial, first of all, it's a way of regulating the number of vehicles that come into Manhattan, which we have to do. And it's a way of generating substantial public investment that then we can turn back into building the light rail and improving the pedestrian environment and keeping these things going. And it would be transformative. It's, I think, one of the single greatest things we could do for this city to get that. And we were only 3 votes of currently convicted or indicted legislators short, I should say, of getting this passed before. And so folks tend to think that it'll never happen. It will happen. It's just a matter of when. So I like your vision.
And I want to add to that. I do agree with this, by the way. So I kind of took your extreme thing and went too far. Here's why I think congestion pricing is an economically efficient thing. I mean, aside from whatever the social ramifications is because you have this infrastructure that is used and it has a high value. And when you let people use things with a high value for free, the market doesn't work efficiently. It's that simple.
And we're just going to have time for 2 more questions. And for those of you who are online, you can try to grab the panelists afterward if they have time. But go ahead.
Hi, I'm Mark Diamond. I live on the Upper West Side. My question concerns people who want to, older people want to stay in the New York metropolitan area. Currently, the FHA guidelines for reverse mortgages apply to apply to condominiums, but not to co-ops. So that means someone in a co-op apartment will not be able to get a reverse mortgage. As you know, reverse mortgages are a key source of tax-free funding for people in their retirement. And as you probably know, that over the last, let's say, 40 years, a lot of the rental units in the greater metropolitan area, including the suburbs, when they converted to home ownership, they converted to co-op ownership and not condominium ownership. So you're talking about a huge swath of population in the city and in the suburbs who would avail themselves of reverse mortgage but cannot, and it's a problem unique to the New York City area, because elsewhere in the country, as you know from the people in Florida, condominiums are the prevailing form of home ownership. So this is really a problem unique to New York, and my question is, do you know of any organizations or elected officials that are lobbying the FHA, which falls under HUD in Washington, to amend their guidelines so that the reverse to cover reverse mortgages for co-ops? Because until the guidelines are amended, banks will not be doing reverse mortgages for co-ops. And I did research on this in the spring. I talked to a few people who are experts on this, and they're waiting for that to happen.
I don't have an answer, but I do have a question. Do you know, is there a certain logic that's used to say why they wouldn't be? It doesn't really make, I haven't really looked at the issue, but I imagine there's some reason.
There is a logic, because I've investigated this.
Okay. Sorry.
I also had my accountant look into it, because all those wonderful ads from Henry Winkler and Fred Thompson and everybody else telling you how, it turns out that you really don't own your co-op.
That's right.
You own shares in the cooperative that owns your co-op. So therefore, technically, under present FHA guidelines and HUD guidelines, you are not an owner.
Right.
And therefore, your mortgage is not something that you can get a reverse on, because it's basically you don't own your apartment. And I was wondering, in your chart here, you have own, rental, and then other. Was other co-ops, or what was other in your chart on housing? What is other? Oh, okay, because I thought that might cover co-ops, but that is their rationale for not doing this. And believe me, I've done, just like this gentleman, I have done a lot of research on this.
Well, I'm going to look into it, and if you can get back to me in a week and ask me if I found anything, because I mean, you can get a mortgage on a co-op, so I don't understand why you can't get a reverse mortgage.
May I say something, please?
Yeah.
A noted real estate attorney who's still practicing today, in the early 1970s, when he bought his 9-room apartment on West End at 105th Street, he said
Like $10,000.
there were no mortgages available at the time. And he said he had to borrow money from friends and relatives, max out his credit card to buy that apartment. But at some point, probably in the late 70s, definitely in the 80s, you could go to any bank and get a mortgage for your purchase or a refinance. Now, you might pay 0.5% more in interest rate, but you could get it. I bought my apartment in 1992, and then I did a refinance 2 years later, and I had no trouble getting a mortgage. So if on the front end they could change the laws, the regulations to allow for mortgages on the front end, they should be able to figure out how to do it on the back end.
I agree.
Even if it means paying 0.5% more in interest, which we would gladly do.
Yeah. I'll look into it.
And we'll move on to
Thank you.
one last question.
Yeah. I'm Chris Bastian with the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. There's been a lot of discussion about focusing on the economic impact of the boomers moving away and whether it's significant or not. And I'd like to challenge that whole framing, because if you look at the data in that same chart for the 50 and over, rich or poor, working or not, think they can retire or not, you already have a majority, 54%, that say we're not likely to move away. And if you take the somewhat likely and assume that some chunk of them will not move either, you're approaching 2/3 of the people 50 and over are saying they're planning to stay here in New York City. And again, regardless of their economic conditions, they're going to have to be able to get up and down stairs. They're going to have to be able to get on buses or in subways. They're going to have to be able to cross the street, and they're going to need all the other resources. So I'd just like to suggest that we look at the bigger picture, which is there are a lot of people that are in fact choosing to stay in the city, and as a that's a percentage, but it's a percentage on a base which is continuing to grow as more and more of the boomers approach that retirement age.
Any response?
And I'll add that, I think one of the reasons that more people probably want to stay in New York than other places is because of the mass transit. I mean, it goes both ways.
All right, and that concludes our Q&A. Let me pass it off to our publisher, Andrew Holt, who's going to make some closing remarks, and then we'll let you all go.
Yeah, I just wanted to say if we can give a round of applause for this great panel. And quickly, I would just encourage all of you in the audience, please sign up for our emails, first read and last read. They're indispensable. You'll find out more about conferences like this, news of the day. You can take a look at some of the follow-up coverage that we're going to do in video and in print and online. And we'll be pushing out some information on another conference upcoming in Albany that we're partnering with AARP on that I would also encourage you to follow along with, and please join us then. So another round of applause for the panel, and thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for the mention. Oh, yeah, great. Thanks for being part of it.